Welcome to Enneagram Conversations with Renee, Siegel. Maybe you know your Enneagram type, but what's next? Renee uses the Enneagram in conjunction with self-awareness practices to help people better understand the patterns of their type, including patterns of thinking, emotions, and behaviors. This show is highly interactive. Listen or call in to find out how to identify your type, and for those who do know their type, what can you do next to open yourself up to a greater capacity for personal transformation? We all have great strengths, sitting alongside areas that we need to strengthen. It starts with noticing your patterns. You'll begin to discern whether you need to step in and take action, or just sit back and observe. Learn how to dance between observation and participation, and watch yourself transform. Enneagram Conversations starts now.
Welcome to Enneagram Conversations. I am so grateful to be here with you today. I am your host, Renee Siegel, and I have two wonderful guests with me today as we explore the Enneagram Type 5, the observer or investigator. I have Jaye Andrus, who is a certified Enneagram professional in the narrative tradition and a certified life coach, and she is the executive director of the Arizona Enneagram Association. I am so grateful for your presence, Jaye. And along with Jaye, we have Pete Lammers, who is a professor in the College of Engineering at Arizona State University and a chief scientist at the Arizona Center for Algae Technology and Innovation. He is also very active in the Arizona Enneagram community. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for being my guest today. And I'm going to turn it over to each of you to begin to have a conversation with our audience about your Enneagram journey. Let's start out in our first segment talking about how did you find the Enneagram? What sustained your interest in the subject, and how did you find your type?
Hi, Jaye.
Okay, you're throwing it to me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Pete.
You're very welcome.
Gosh, a friend of mine invited me to go to an Enneagram intro. This was back in probably, 2005. And Linda Frazee, who is now a friend of mine, but I didn't know at the time, was doing that workshop. And I don't know, I grokked it. It just resonated at a very deep level. I found my type that night. I did a little, checking on it later, but I remained on 5, around a little bit with 7, but there's that line. Then interestingly, Linda and I became friends, and she had just gotten a request to work in the Maricopa County court system, working with Superior Court judges and their staff. And through a sort of series of events, I ended up helping her out on one of those workshops. And we worked well together. I really enjoyed it. And I went on to get certified. I did it pretty fast, got certified in 2006. And then we started working together right away on that contract and others. And I've been doing this work ever since then.
I first learned about the Enneagram by reading Helen Palmer's first book, just called The Enneagram. I think that was in the 90s sometime. I had a long-standing interest in human development, meditation, the whole concept of enlightenment, whether the Western concept or the Eastern concept might be more appropriate, or how to meld those two. And upon reading that book, I knew immediately that I was a 5. There just wasn't any question about it. And it, in reading the book, it was deep, which appealed to my 5 nature. And yet it was comprehensive. And I think I didn't really understand how different the different types could be, nor did I really understand how many different types of 5s or 8s or any number that you pick might be out there. And so it's sort of laid fallow in the sort of parlor game area of the mind for a couple of decades until I reached a challenging point in my life where I had to sort of reintegrate. And I started working directly with Jay and the AEA. And that was about 4 years ago now. And it went much deeper this time. And it sort of served as almost group therapy for me, in the sense that talking about how I perceived issues and then hearing other people, either within this type or the other types, it really kind of helped to solidify an understanding of how the appearances of the different types can be sussed out in your experiences in relationship. And it pointed out to me the limitations that I have outside the 5, 7, 8 triad, where I have lines to those other types. And I learned a lot about why, or maybe why, how the 8s and 7s keep showing up in my life. I just feel comfortable with them quite intuitively and quite rapidly. You get a bunch of 5s together, you get a bunch of 3s together, doesn't matter what your type is. There's a tendency for us to sort of intuitively understand one another and feel some trust and understanding. And then I realized that extended for me with 8s and 7s. And so it just kind of went on from there as a couple of examples. But moving from just reading about it to interacting with people who actually know a lot more than I do was really the key to putting it into practice, understanding some of my blind spots, what drives behaviors, just stopping to listen into the self-talk channel, I call it, that kind of provides commentary in the background, and associating that with the components of being a 5.
Yeah. You bring up so many good points, both of you do. And I'm going to just make a comment about your last one, Pete, and then I want to move into a couple of questions. One of the reasons that I don't just talk about the type when we present the type is then hearing about type through the narrative and the lens of a particular type has so much more gusto, so much more vibrancy than an academic teaching. And an academic teaching remains an academic teaching unless you do something with it. And these practices that you're talking about really allow you to live the experience and not use it as an excuse to, put yourself in that number, but allow yourself to be much more expansive, which we're going to talk about in the next 3 segments of the show. But before we finish this segment, a lot of people who are viewers and listeners have trouble identifying their type, or they've been involved with other personality assessments. And because we have a wide range of viewers and listeners, I'm wondering if the Enneagram was the only personality type, assessment that you ever came across that kind of grabbed your interest, or what you might say to someone who's frustrated because even if they have been looking at the Enneagram, they still can't land on a type.
Oh, yeah. The Enneagram, well, I was familiar with Myers-Briggs, and I've also worked with another system since learning the Enneagram for a while. The Enneagram, though, I still love, even though it can be a little bit difficult in the beginning if you're somebody who just wants to take a test and be told what you are. But what I love about the Enneagram is that the very process of finding yourself requires you to do self-observation. And that's really the whole point of doing this work in the first place, is to become more self-observant, to become more self-aware. And so it's a juicy time finding your type, and it's not to be rushed. So many people just want to, quote, nail their type. And then it becomes very focused on behavior. And because people behave similarly, but do that for very, very, very different reasons, you have to, in order to find your type, ask yourself what's driving that behavior. Why do I do what I do? And so, you know, no test, no matter how good it is, no Enneagram test, I should say, is going to tell you what your type is. It's going to give you a starting point or two, and then you have to do some discernment, which again is the whole point in the first place. Because as you become more observant and more aware of why you do what you do, you tend to start shifting and changing a little bit just through this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would add that there's a developmental arc to everyone's lives. And I don't present as a 5 today in the same way that I presented as a 5 when I was in my 20s or my teens or in between. And yet some of those same drivers were present throughout. It's just that as we learn a little bit more about ourselves and begin to sort of see our blind spots, then we can sort of expand the stance from which we react to life. So if you're having trouble figuring out what your type is, I would second what Jay said and just don't worry about it. Just start paying attention. Learn the basic notations around typical behaviors and motivations for the different types. And then just keep interacting. The Arizona Enneagram Association was a marvelous system for me to drop into, because there were a bunch of folks that all the different types and weekly meetings, and that was how I really learned it. I don't know that it really could have happened any better than the way it did. But you have to work with it, and you have to put yourself out there a little bit. It's not something that 5s are typically anxious to do.
Yeah. Now, that's really a good point. So there's richness. There's a very rich journey, but it requires a lot of patience if you don't land on a type, immediately. And so what I would tell our listeners and viewers out there is that if you're new to the Enneagram and you have landed on a couple of types and taking an assessment, don't give up. There is a great, rich opportunity for you to practice self-observation, increased awareness, questioning with tender-hearted curiosity why you might be doing and feeling and thinking some of the things that you do in that process. That process is so very rich, but it is not a process that's particularly endorsed by our society at large. It's like we want to land on something fast and have an answer fast and move fast so that we can get to the next piece. And that is not what the Enneagram is all about or offers people in terms of a journey. So I thank you both. We finished our first segment. We're going to get ready to go to break. And when we come back, we're going to learn about the challenges of type 5, the assets of type 5, what particular personality characteristics each of our guests resonated with. I thank you for tuning in. I am Renee Siegel, your host. Welcome again to Enneagram Conversations. We'll be right back after break. Thank you. Welcome back to Enneagram Conversations, where I have two amazing guests today with me, type 5s, Jaye Andress and Pete Lammers, talking to you about what it is to be a type 5. And so for those of you who don't know anything about a 5, for those of you who are 5s, for those of you who are interested in type 5s, I'm going to turn it over to them to talk about just the various characteristics and aspects. One of the things that happened in our last segment was we talked about how people can look the same, but be internally motivated to behave and think and feel differently about some of the same things that we all encounter in life. So what characteristics were clear to you that were type 5 that you identified with and resonated with about being a 5?
Well, for me, the name The Observer was basically all I needed. I've been following my curiosity my whole life. as a young person, I had to know why. I couldn't follow directions. I couldn't do what I was told without knowing why. And if I didn't agree, then I wanted to talk about that. And of course, you mature a little bit and go with the flow after you realize that you don't want to beat your head against that wall endlessly, because you're going to run into people who won't engage on that question of why. And so it really wasn't any deeper than that for me. It was just sort of instantly recognizing that, I'm curiosity driven. I'm an observer. The underlying fear bit around the head types was and continues to be a challenge for me to understand. Maybe just being an observer, the notion that I am being observed brought forth some trepidation, some fear. But I didn't really need much more input than, yes, I'm trying to figure out how things work. And this heuristic system of the Enneagram, and that allows us to suss out how incredibly complex things are, and yet see repeating patterns of motivation and behavior on the part of individuals of different types that makes sense. And that's sort of the genius of the narrative tradition. It just sort of emerges from the properties of human beings, and even though we don't understand why or how, it does seem to have predictive value. So there you go, that's my take.
And before you turn it over to Jay, so what are some of the characteristics? Some of our viewers and listeners may not even know what characteristics are kind of talked about in terms of the type structure, other than observation. There's a lot of things that are very particular to your type.
Well, Jay's probably a better person to talk about that than me. I'm
Okay.
going to toss that back her direction and let her.
There you go.
I feel like I need a catcher's mitt over here. Yes. Now, there's a lot. The wanting to understand, making sense of things. I was not aware of how, until this work, of how much I say that doesn't make sense or that makes sense. Sense is apparently a really important thing to make. Wanting to understand, and at a very big picture level, like wanting to just understand, why are we here and what's the point of this existence? I mean, it could be very existential. And but some of the things that got talked about, were protection of time and energy is a big one. And that really resonated with me, because I've all my life kind of walked this odd little line between being, getting bored, which I don't want to be, but then also getting too busy. And, it doesn't really make sense, because I don't get too busy because I'm careful not to. And so the explanation that would come up from teachers was that there was a concern around not having enough energy. And I would think to myself, well, I have plenty of energy. And so I couldn't quite make that connection to that. But then I would ask myself, well, if you have plenty of energy, then why are you so careful with committing? I used to call it committing, which is also kind of a 7 thing, because I wanted to keep my options open, right? That was another player in all of that. So I just had to come to recognize that I had concerns about that, and concerns about being depleted. Whether I thought I had enough energy or not, working backwards from it, I got, okay, well, that has to be what's running there underneath everything else. That's the explanation. The head type, I mean, I know that I'm very analytical, and I try to keep things away from getting too emotional. So, it's kind of a protective stance, I suppose. If you can stay up in your head and you don't have to feel your heart, you don't have to feel, wounded or sad. Although I will say that I have a strong 4 wing. And so I have always been attracted to 4-ly movies, 4-ly books. It's a kind of closely guarded secret until now, apparently, because I've just told you all. But, I would sort of find time to wallow in that a little bit when I was by myself. So I'm going to date myself here, but Joni Mitchell's Blue CD was one of my favorites. I would just love to listen to that and be sad. So there is that. But if it was real life, I would prefer that people around me not get too emotional and that I not have to be very emotional. I'd rather just keep it logical and rational, and can we just be calm and talk about this? There was a lot of emotion in my family. It was just too much. And so I preferred to keep things up here. It was safer and less draining, even though I didn't realize that that was a concern. Too much emotion could feel very, very, very draining. That's the thing that I do resonate with around being drained. Not activity so much, but too much emotion could feel like that. Calm in a crisis. I think that's probably fading some for me, but typically if something is going wrong, my modus operandi is to go immediately into solution. What can we do about this? And I do that really fast. I'll just like kind of, what would be a good analogy for this? I just put a lid on sort of the emotion, or at least try the emotional aspect of what's going on. I mean, my hands might be shaking, but I'm going to, how can we solve what's going on here? The other thing, and there's probably more, but the withdrawing and withholding. So if I would get hurt, especially hurt, if I got angry, I would be more comfortable expressing that. But if I got wounded, I would withhold. I would pull away. I'd get cold. And that is an aspect of my personality type that I really dislike and have worked on. And I'm proud to say, I'm happy to say that I really don't do that much. It might be my initial knee-jerk reaction, but I got so tired of doing it. I still remember the very first time I made the decision not to do it. And so I will talk things out. I move toward. I'm much more willing to go into the heart space. I worked with a heart type for many, many years, and she helped me work on that, I think. It was tough. I wanted to stay away from that, but I don't so much anymore. I'm willing to go into that territory.
Yeah, well said. I think that reserved label that often is put on 5s is a direct result of sort of analyzing all the time and not paying enough attention to the interaction between thoughts and feelings. And it does require an effort for 5s to let those feelings in. For me, that are often kind of overpowering. And it's gotten better as I've practiced on it, but feelings that were very strong kind of would have the tendency to shut down my intellect, and I didn't know what to do or say, and then that was interpreted, wrongly as that was my intent to pull away, but no, I'm just kind of paralyzed. So you got to work at those things in order to overcome them, and it's not easy. But we have aligned to 7s, and 7s know how to be in the moment, play, and have a good time. And we have aligned to 8s, and 8s know how to take charge when it's necessary. So we can do these things. We're equipped with natural methods for overcoming our major tendencies as 5s.
Yeah, you've hit on so many amazing points, and we're going to continue on with them after a break. But just to reiterate, we're talking about type 5, which is a head type. It sits in the head centered, the 5s, 6s, and 7s of the Enneagram type. So there's a lot of strategy to mentalize and strategize and map out things and be logical and find solutions and feel far more comfortable with thoughts than emotions. For those of you who are new to the Enneagram, you're going to hear more when we come back about just some of the easy assets and gifts of being a 5 and some of the challenges of being a 5. I I thank you so much for tuning in today and listening to Enneagram Conversations. We'll be back after break. My name is Renee Siegel. If you'd like to know anything about my work, you can find it at yourpurepotential.com. That's the letter U, the letter R, purepotential.com. I welcome you returning and joining us again after break. Thank you. Welcome back to Enneagram Conversations, where we are discussing the Type 5, the Investigator and Observer today. And I'm going to just ask our guests to jump back in. We have Jaye and Pete today, who identify as that particular type, talking about their own experiences, both with the Enneagram, through their own self-discovery, increased self-awareness. And we're going to pick up now, again, talking a little bit more about the attributes of the 5 and how each of them knew they were a 5. But also we'll move then into the gifts of the type, the assets of that type, what that type really brings out and comes to the world with, to give as a gift to the world that others of us may not do or think or feel in the same way. So Jaye, you want to pick up and talk a little bit about that minimalist piece?
Sure. Yeah, we mentioned this on break. And it actually goes to both points that you're talking about. It's a trait, and I feel it's become a gift. But it's minimalism. I really appreciate simplicity, and I like having a simple life. I don't need a lot of stuff. I can feel burdened if there's a lot of stuff. I used to joke that if I have one of something, that's enough. And I have a lot of stories around that we probably don't have time for. But what I appreciate about this time that we're in right now, even though there's such sort of dire things going on in our world, for a long time as a minimalist, I think I almost kind of felt shamed by it because the focus was always on more and more and more and bigger and having more. And, it was even part of the whole spiritual abundance movement tended to go towards stuff. And now, because of the sad and really dire place that our planet is in, people are finally starting to at least talk about reusing, recycling, having less, getting by with less. And I feel like I'm in style finally after all this time. So I look at minimalism as one of the traits of the 5. It can certainly go too far, but it's also a gift. I think it's a gift that our planet needs right now.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk, before we go any further, let's talk about how it is a liability. I mean, today it is an asset. So many of the things that you brought up are so important, and people are purging and recycling and reusing and finally realizing that our planet is in dire straits in so many ways, and we throw out things. But when does it become a challenge?
When does being a 5?
No, the
Or
minimalism.
minimalism.
Yeah.
Boy, that's a tough question. I resonate with what Jaye said about, just needing one, not needing a whole lot of variation. For me, it comes down to having the time and the energy to go to deeper levels. And so, as a college student, learning about chemistry and biology was incredibly empowering to me because it helped me explain to myself how things work on many different levels. And it takes time to dive down into all of that complexity. And if your life is on the surface of a lot of different relationships and responsibilities, it's difficult to find the time and the energy to tease out what might turn out to be important interconnections between systems that might allow us to, for example, I'm right now starting to work on recycling rare earth elements, which are important in batteries and wind turbines and all kinds of alternative energies. We have a very limited supply of rare earth elements on the planet, and we need to figure out ways of recycling those. And without having had the time to go deep into learning a lot of different scientific disciplines, I wouldn't be able to contribute to that. And yet, because of all of that work that I was motivated to do as a 5, what I find now is that there's just no end to opportunity to figure out how to do things better, more efficiently, and more sustainably. So it really is a gift to be able to pull away and dive down in the mind and think about how things might work and how the human mind creates meaning out of the sensory inputs that we have. It's really quite amazing.
One of the areas that is often taught about 5s is this gathering information and need for facts, information, and what happens with information. And I think there's an asset and a challenge in that arena too. I mean, I when I certified as an Enneagram instructor, I asked to have a panel of 5s because I thought it was the toughest. Group for me to understand, and I made so many mistakes in terms of my assumptions about 5s. One of them was that, as culturally and seeing myself as somewhat intrusive, I thought maybe it's because I just want to know too much that I'm draining the energy from people. Maybe I'm too invasive, and I realized that. So I just backed off entirely, and my panel said, "We don't want you to go away." It's like, we really do want you to engage, so it was just trying to find a pace that kind of really honored that back and forth. And the other thing that I remember making a mistake about, because I have a son that's a 5, that's one of the reasons I chose to have a panel of 5s, is, and he was raised with all sisters, so you can imagine it was a very interesting experience for him, was to tell me when it was enough or too much. And he is a brilliant kid, man today, not a kid, a man. And I would often see him just gathering information and reading, and it was just voracious. It was like, when is it enough? And he said, "What do you mean enough? Could you talk about that?"
Well, yeah, I'd like to address that because it's up for me a lot right now, and it has been for a few years actually, where I'm actually tired of, I still go to why, and I'll look stuff up, and it doesn't matter what it is. I'll just look, I wonder why, and I'm looking something up. But a few years ago, I actually got tired of reading, and I wanted a different way to know. I was even at one of B and Uranio's workshops, and that's what I was working on. It was a very small workshop. We were each working on something with them, and that was mine, is that I want a different way to know. I want greater connection to intuition. And so I don't read as much as I used to. I'm tired of it. It really hasn't gotten me where I wanted to get. I'm trying to understand things. And reading hasn't gotten me there. And so I'm off of it a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you bring up such a key Enneagram teaching, and that is, the Enneagram shares that we have various portals and ways of getting information. We can assimilate information through facts and mentalizing, strategizing. We can gather information through this heart-centered experience and the wisdom of our emotions, and we gather information instinctively through our bodies. And when you talked about that, I'm wondering if, when you were referring to that, were you talking about assimilating or gathering body-based information?
Yes, or I don't know where it would come exactly. I think it's there. I think I just don't pay attention to it. I think I'm actually probably fairly intuitive, and I have a hard time giving it legitimacy. Mm-hmm. I still want to research it. I still want to check it out through the head. But I'm trying to pay more attention to subtle energies, to intuitive knowing. haven't got quite the hang of it yet, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I actually spend a fair amount of my daily meditation time working on the interaction between thoughts and feelings, feelings of all kinds. And so I have to kind of orient on, well, what am I feeling right now? Because otherwise, I'm either focusing on the sensations of my breath, or I'm thinking. And then I come back to what I'm supposed to be doing, and then I'm off thinking. But when I bring in the element of feeling and the interaction between feelings and thoughts in particular, that's where intuition can manifest for me. Because I'm thinking along a certain line of thought, that tends to create a feeling associated with it. Or if I'm focusing on a pleasant feeling, that tends to bring certain cognitive thought patterns to mind. And it almost becomes like playing a video game when you're meditating. It's what do you want to experience? Well, what are you experiencing? What are you feeling? What are you thinking about that? Or vice versa. And intuition is one of those emergent properties that requires sort of a distributed attention. If you're too focused in the head, you don't have access to all the information that you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the amazing things we're going to talk about before the show is over is just we've had a resurgence, unfortunately, due to everything that's going on in our world, to trauma. And trauma is something that it has no real direct resolution through thinking. And being a therapist for a long time, I've seen firsthand how many people attempt to try and use traditional methods of addressing what we're all experience some level of trauma. And the whole introduction of this body-based or intuitive, instinctual kind of experiences, we're finally paying attention to the fact that we have an enteric brain, that 95% of all mood altering experiences that we create internally are manufactured in our belly. They're not manufactured in our skull brain. And it's just amazing how, finally this unfortunate issue of trauma being so apparent has brought our attention to the body, and this instinctual belly-based enteric brain experience that you're talking about. Yeah. Thank you guys so much. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back and we'll talk about what you guys would love for other people to know about fives so that they can get along better with you in the world. Join me again after break. I'm Renee Siegel. Thank you so much for joining Enneagram Conversations. Welcome back to Enneagram Conversations. I'm so pleased to be here with you today with my guests, Jaye and Pete, talking about the Observer Investigator Enneagram Type 5. This is the final segment of our show today, and we're going to talk. Everybody wants to be loved. Everybody wants connection. Everybody wants to be engaged in some way. And, it's the best is when we can hear from the type what helps you engage with this particular type 5 and what challenges they've had with engaging with others in the past. So turning it over to you guys.
Well, obviously challenges emerge as we need to engage and communicate on a deep level with types that we don't necessarily understand. So I don't have a good intuitive understanding, for example, of threes or ones. Those two in particular are difficult for me to understand. Ones have a line to 7. I have a line to 7, so I can meet there, and there can be some dialogue there. But there's aspects of ones that had I an understanding of the sort of basic drive to figure things out in terms of right and wrong of a one would have been really helpful in my interactions with various ones that I've encountered over the span of my life. So there's lots of examples like that where The Enneagram heuristic gives you an opportunity to say, okay, I'm having difficulty here. What can I learn about these other types on an intellectual level? And then how can I translate that into being open on a feeling level with the dynamic of that other type that doesn't come naturally to me? So that's kind of the great power of the Enneagram, is that the stuff that comes easily, well, that's nice, and you can understand why it comes easily. But now the challenge is, okay, how can we master enough of the details on the types that we don't intuitively understand so that it can become more so? And then you got a two-way street. And not everybody's going to be aware of the Enneagram. And so sometimes you're going to have to do the work in order to establish that deeper level of understanding and trust. So it's a really powerful system, but it does require some work in order to make it useful and skillful.
Mm-hmm. What would you tell somebody who wanted to relate to you better? What do you need? What do you...
Well, I always appreciate any means of being pulled out of my head. So people that make me laugh are greatly appreciated. Just being themselves and open is you don't have to be the same in order to have juice in an interaction. And so I've been misunderstood as being, reserved and cold for reasons that I now understand and can work to overcome. But if people understood that, we have this tendency to kind of sink into the mind and miss what might be overt cues on a feeling level, shouldn't be taken as an indication that we don't want to connect or that we can't.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
I think it's a little tricky, probably, and I can understand that for others, you're playing that, sort of walking that line between being afraid of being intrusive and but wanting to connect. And so, I really, over the past, since meeting the Enneagram, and especially working first on the board of the AEA and then as executive director of the AEA, I have had to, I've grown tremendously in this arena. And so I'm sort of having to talk about the way it used to be, but you don't want to overwhelm a 5 with a whole ton of emotion. What people we need to recognize about 5s is really, we're very sensitive people. It doesn't take much.
Right.
You don't have to water the garden with a fire hose. I get things from just a little bit. You don't have to throw a whole lot of emotion at me for me to understand that you're upset or afraid or whatever. I get that pretty quickly. I think it's hard for I'll just speak to myself, to be vulnerable. So I think that I probably need to be drawn out somewhat, asked about feelings, but not intrusively so. Because I've suffered through the years from sort of a reveal regret syndrome, where, especially in the early days of the Enneagram, when we had to be on panels and I would share something and then I'd feel like, oh, I shouldn't have revealed that, because, privacy is a pretty big deal for 5s. And so sharing at a deeper level can disrupt that and I guess bring forth vulnerability. And the whole setup is so protective, as I suppose any setup is. So I think that underneath all of that, sort of what Pete referred to as aloof or cold, is just a heightened sensitivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I don't think any type is more eager to be vulnerable than any other type. I mean, vulnerability is one of those things where if you asked a room full of people, how many of you love being vulnerable, you wouldn't see a ton of hands being raised, but you're talking about it within the lens of your type. So just talk, if each of you could talk just a little bit more about that particular type of resistance, through the type, because I I can speak about it through my own type, but I think that there's great value in hearing through, if privacy is so regarded, maybe that's a big piece of it.
Well, when Jay used the word intrusive, it occurred to me that it works both ways. I worry a lot about being intrusive into other people's space. And then you run into folks who never give it a second thought. And so it's a two-edged sword, really. And like you say, who does really want to be vulnerable? The reveal regret syndrome is real for everyone. And yet, if we don't process our feelings, if we don't sort of work with that discursive thought feeling dynamic, then we're whitewashing our entire lives, really. And that's not good. It isn't, there's no way to evolve if you're kind of going like this with a major portion of your sensory systems. Feelings are hugely important sources of information. It's delicate, it's difficult, it crosses all kinds of different types. This is the key bit, and unless people are willing to open up and find a safe environment to do that, then growth doesn't happen. It's stifled.
Yeah. And I think interactions like this are really helpful for people to get some insight into how to do that with various people in their life. As we close today, there are a lot of things going on potentially for each of you. I'd like to give you some time. I know, Jay, you've got some things happening, and I'd love for you to share with our viewers and listeners some things about your practice. I know you're coaching. Could you tell our viewers and listeners more?
Yeah, sure. I do Enneagram coaching, and I really love it. My website is jandres.com. And I'm going to have more time for that next year as the Arizona Enneagram Association turns its material over to the narrative Enneagram, and we are going to be closing the organization. Before we do that, we do have a final event this year that I want to let everybody know about because it's so relevant to our times right now. It's been a heck of 18 months. A lot of stress and trauma out there. And our very own Renee Siegel and her business partner, Sharon K. Ball, are doing a Discovering Resilience workshop for the AEA. This is on November 6th. I invite you all to attend because I think there is probably nobody who wouldn't benefit from understanding trauma and stress and trauma in the relationship, and when stress becomes trauma. To some extent, we've all been traumatized for the past year and a half. I often tell my clients that consider the fact that maybe some of the stress that they're feeling isn't even their own because there's so much in the collective right now. There is just lots of animosity. There's lots of anger. There's a whole heck of a lot of stress. There's a lot of fear. There's a whole lot of fear. And so for myself, I'm really looking forward to this November 6th workshop. ArizonaEnneagram.org is where you can find out more about it. I take my hat off to you, Renee, for being willing to do it because I know that you've been studying polyvagal theory for a very long time and have a lot of knowledge and expertise in this arena. And so for myself, I know it's going to be very valuable, and I can't imagine anyone who wouldn't benefit from it after the year and a half we've had.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And I really do hope we could certainly all benefit from it. I benefit every time I learn more about trauma interventions and how to just calm myself down. We are all experiencing more than challenge, more than stress. It has all moved into our bodies in some fashion. I want to express my deep appreciation for both of you joining Enneagram Conversations today. Your contribution is so meaningful to me, and I'm sure everybody else that's tuned in. If you'd like to know more about my practice, you can hear about it at or or learn about it at yourpurepotential.com. That's the letter U, the letter R, purepotential.com. And again, thank you for tuning in today to Enneagram Conversations. And thank you, Jay, and thank you, Pete.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Enneagram Conversations. Renee is on a mission to guide people towards cultivating inner observation, which assists with self-awareness and expansion. Identify your type, notice your patterns, and learn how to unlock the higher aspects of your Enneagram type. There is limitless potential inside you already, just waiting to be unveiled. Join Renee next time on this journey of self-discovery and create more purpose and power in your life. For more information about Renee and her work, visit yourpurepotential.com. That's the letter U, the letter R, purepotential.com. Until next time, remember, you are pure potential.